Unfortunately, studying some backgrounds and the introductions to Hebrews can be a little bit frustrating. There are several questions that we want to answer, but a lot of those questions are quite difficult given what we know about Hebrews. So in this session, we're going to talk about the possible who, or really the whos, the what, the when, the where, and the why of how Hebrews came to be. So starting, we have our burning question: who wrote Hebrews? We really don't know. That may not be what you want to hear, but usually scholars want to start with something like an author profile. They're going to talk about what we do know about the author based on what we have in the text. So some of the things that we know: this person is clearly operating from within a Jewish framework, or at least is very familiar with Jewish ideas and practices. This person probably has some familiarity with Greco-Roman philosophy. They seem to be educated in rhetoric and argumentation. The letter has very sophisticated Greek. And we also know that this person is some sort of associate of Paul. Some of Paul's friends are mentioned, like Timothy and maybe Priscilla and Aquila. But we'll get to that. What I like to do, because this author profile is rather general, I like to break this down into two categories. As far as the history of interpretation for Hebrews goes, it's been quite common to identify the author of Hebrews in two different planes. So some are authors with known writings, and some are authors without known writings. In that first category, we have Clement, Luke, and Paul. The last of these is probably the one with which you're the most familiar. The idea, especially since in the early reception of Hebrews circulates as a Pauline letter, is that Paul is the author. And in fact, several early Christian authors identify Paul as the author, but it's not universal. As early as the 2nd and 3rd century, people start to raise some questions about whether Paul wrote Hebrews. The main thing is that the style of the Greek doesn't align with Paul. His argumentation flows in a slightly different way, and there are some things in the theology of Hebrews that just looks a little bit different than some of the emphases that we see in Paul. It's also the case that Paul is supposedly the apostle to the Gentiles, and this, as it comes to be known, is a letter to the Hebrews. And so that creates some tension for some as well. Another author with known writings that's often identified is Luke. And sometimes Luke and Paul get paired together as a team. The idea is that if the Greek doesn't sound like Paul, then maybe he had a little bit of help. It's Paul's ideas, Paul's word, or his theology, or something like that. But Luke comes in and either translates Paul's Hebrew or writes down some notes or something like that. Some think that Luke wrote Hebrews on his own, but usually when Luke is identified, he's identified alongside Paul. Another author that's often identified is Clement of Rome, and Clement wrote the letter that we now call 1 Clement to the Corinthian church. And in that, there are actually several quotations and pieces that look a lot like Hebrews. So there are a lot of different reasons that this could be. One could be that Clement is the author of Hebrews, but more frequently, people think that this just reflects Clement's knowledge of the Epistle to the Hebrews. The other category, so those are the authors with known writings. Authors without known writings, we have Barnabas, one of Paul's companions in Acts. He is identified as one who exhorts, the exhorter, and Hebrews identifies itself as a word of exhortation. Some think that this might be a subtle hint from Barnabas, a little clue that he's the author. And Barnabas is also a Levite, and since Hebrews has quite a bit within it that refers to Jewish practices, their sacrifices, their festivals and things, people think that Barnabas would be quite a good candidate for this. The last two, in some sense, could be taken together. We have Apollos, who's identified in Acts 18 as someone who was a very well-educated Jewish person from Alexandria. This fits quite well with the author profile that we noted before. And he has a wide range of understanding of Jewish theology and practice, but he doesn't quite understand how that fits with who Jesus is, with the Christ, especially as identified as Jesus. He is taught by Prisca or Priscilla and Aquila and comes to understand that more fully. And so some think that because Hebrews has such a focus on who Jesus is in light of Scripture, that this fits quite well with Apollos. And for the same reasons as that, Prisca fits quite well too. She is well educated. She has this understanding of how Jesus and Scripture fit together. She's a well-educated Jewish person, and she is occupying the same spaces as Apollos, for example. It is the case that there is one single participle in Hebrews that is self-referential, or that where the author refers to themselves. And in Greek, this is gendered. That participle is masculine. And so some think that this disqualifies Prisca. We shall see. So that's a very broad overview about who wrote Hebrews. But as is often the case, I will quote Origen. As to who wrote Hebrews, God only knows. Another question with respect to Hebrews is, what is it? Some wonder if this is a sermon or a letter. Most of our letters in the New Testament open with something like, so-and-so to those people in that location, grace and peace. And Hebrews instead opens at many times and in various ways. God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets. That's quite different. But Hebrews does close like a letter. And because we have other examples like 1 John, where letters don't open in the typical way, I think that it's still very possible that Hebrews is a letter. But I'm open. The other questions, when was Hebrews written, who received it, and why, we can move through a little more quickly. The question of when Hebrews is written is one that is quite contentious. The big question with Hebrews and other New Testament books is whether it was written before or after 70, which is when the temple is destroyed. With Hebrews, this is a particularly live question because the author is so frequently referring to the sacrificial practices of the Jewish people. The question is, if they weren't currently practicing those things, how would the destruction of the temple play a role in the author's argumentation? Unfortunately, the arguments on both sides of this perform something like what we would call mirror reading. They basically are looking at the text and looking for clues. But the author doesn't give us an explicit indication. And so we can come back to this a little bit when we talk about why Hebrews is written. But here I want to just tell you that the evidence is unclear. Another important question is, who received the epistle to the Hebrews? In the 2nd century, the title "To the Hebrews" was added to the letter, but it's not so simple as saying, well, it must be a Jewish audience. We have clues within the text that these people actually could be Gentiles or Jews. And so the most plausible explanation is actually that they're probably a group of mixed ethnicities, that some are religiously and ethnically Jewish and others are not. And so what we see in the Epistle to the Hebrews is a call for them to identify themselves as the people of God. When he says God spoke to our ancestors at the outset of the book, he's effectively calling these two groups together. Where this group is located is another question, who received this book more concretely. And it's quite often the case that the church is identified as a church within Rome. Very briefly, we'll return to the structure throughout the sessions, but I think that Hebrews is best understood as a book in 3 parts. The first part, which is Hebrews 1:1 to 4:16, is about the household of God. This is where the author is identifying who the family of God is. He starts with the Father and the Son, those two together. In Hebrews 2, he's going to talk about humanity, the brothers and sisters of the Son, the children of God. And then he's going to talk about what it looks like for this family of God to travel through the wilderness together. So the second section of Hebrews actually begins at 4:11. And that goes all the way to 10:25. And here, rather than being located in the house or the household of God, instead the author shifts to another space, to the tabernacle, a house of God, but in a different way. This is where the authors focus on the priesthood, the priestly ministry of Jesus, his offering on our behalf. All of that comes into focus. And so in this second section, we see this theme really come to the fore. The third section, which again has another bit of overlap, begins at Hebrews 10:19. So there's a short transitional section here as well. It could be understood as running from 10:19 to the very end of the letter, or stopping at the end of chapter 12. And here, rather than the house or the tabernacle, the focus is on the city or mountain of God. This space is more subtle throughout this section, but it's very clear that the author is talking about what does it look like for the community to operate within the city itself, to be sort of in or to be citizens, and then also is talking about their destination, which is the heavenly city and Mount Zion. So this is the 3-part section of Hebrews that I find really helpful. And again, it's organized around those spaces. So this is our introduction to Hebrews.